For over a year, I've been railing against our government's shitty response to COVID and the economic crisis. And one of the areas that I've focused my criticism on is how they aren't doing nearly enough to meet the moment, to meet the scale of the crisis. They've passed three stimulus bills, I believe: the CARES Act, the stimulus bill that passed in December with the $600 check, and they passed this most recent one, I forgot what Joe Biden called it, the American Rescue Act or whatever, the most recent stimulus bill with the $1,400 stimulus check. Means tested. All those stimulus checks are means tested. But I've criticized all these stimulus bills and the overall response because these bills, these pieces of legislation are supposed to be a response to an emergency, and they're supposed to be meeting people's real emergent needs right now in this moment. And absolutely none of these stimulus bills come even close to doing that. People are about to be evicted. They can't pay rent, can't pay mortgage. Utilities about to be cut off. Don't have food to put on the table for their kids. Don't have money for medication or medical treatments. These are emergent issues that are happening right now. That's what these stimulus bills are supposed to address. But instead of addressing any of those systemic problems that tens of millions of people in this country are facing right now, they've all been Band-Aids on a bullet wound. They've come nowhere close to meeting the moment. And you have things like one means tested $1,400 check that some people won't get, millions won't get. And it's just one time. And if they're going to send anything else up, they have to pass a whole other stimulus. Like, none of these bills meet the moment. That's one part of the criticism. And that's where a lot of my outrage has been. But there's a whole other side of the equation here. There's a whole other part to be outraged about, which is, it's not that the government has just sat back and done nothing over the last year. They have been working overtime, but to help the rich and corporations run out the back door with all the money. So it's a double whammy, if you will. They on top of not helping the people who are in desperate need right now, the public who needs the government to actually work for them, which is the whole purpose of government. And on top of not doing that, they're writing blank checks and giving unlimited bailouts to the richest corporations and the richest people in the country. So it is a robbery. It is a heist on a scale that really is unmatched that I could ever think of at any time in U.S. history. This is worse than the Wall Street bailouts after the 2008 crash. That's how out of control and insane this never-ending corporate heist that's been going on for the last year has been. And that's important context to have, because it shows you how full of shit all of these politicians are, Democrat and Republican, how full of shit they all are when they want to go around and clutching their pearls and penny pinching when people suggest policies to bail out the public. That's when everybody becomes a deficit hawk. That's when everybody is concerned about the debt and the deficit, which is all bullshit. If you understand modern monetary theory, the government has unlimited money at their disposal. So that's when they all decide to become fiscally conservative when it comes to policies that will bail out the public. But you see how full of shit it all is and how disingenuous they all are. Because when it comes to gratuitous, unnecessary bailouts to giant multi-million-dollar, in some cases multi-billion-dollar corporations, they will do that and they will not even bat an eyelash. You won't hear a one time, where's the money coming from? How are we going to pay for this? We have to cut it from somewhere else in these corporate handouts that we're giving if they need this money now. None of that. Oh, do we have the money to cover this policy? That isn't even a first thought, second thought, or third thought. When it comes to giving out money to the rich and corporations, the government does it at ease without even thinking about it. And it just shows you the state of the government that we have right now. It isn't any type of democracy of representative government, or else they would be legislating on behalf of the people. And that means bailouts for the people. That means policies like Medicare for all, rent and mortgage debt cancellation, UBI, monthly recurring checks to everybody. That's what the government would be doing if they're representing us, but they're not. This is an oligarchy. It's a plutocracy, and it's a corporatocracy, and the government is solely working on behalf of the corporations and the rich. And even more disgusting is they're using the current crisis, the current emergency between the pandemic and the economic crisis. They're using that as cover to pass some of the most heinous corporatist policies, neoliberal policies that you could ever imagine, that they would have absolutely no way of getting passed in legislation if they weren't using the cover of the current emergency to do it. So it's outrageous on so many different levels. And if I was going to get into every single detail of how terrible the response is and how much they favor corporations and the wealthy in this country, I'd have to do a whole fucking hour-long deep dive about it. And honestly, might have to do that at some point if nobody else is willing to do it. But so let me just give you a couple examples. So I want to go over about 3 different areas of these corporate bailouts for you. I'm going to start with the bailout of the airline industry. Then I'm going to talk about the bailout and giant giveaway to the health insurance industry, and also the PPP program, because that was the kicker. That was sold to the public as, hey man, we're doing something for the small business. This is exclusively for the small business owners who don't have the funds to make it through this emergency. Well, we have this PPP program here to save the day, cover your payroll, and keep your business open. That's what the PPP program was sold as. But again, it was just a giant corporate scam. And even some members of Congress were in on it and got their piece from the PPP loans. Now, I'm going to start with the bailout of the airline industry. All right, so in total, the airline industry got about $60 billion in the CARES Act. Then they got $15 billion in the stimulus bill that passed in December. And I'm not sure exactly how much money they got in this most recent bill that passed this March. But let's just go off of the $17 billion that the industry got over the last year. So the airline industry got almost I think they literally got everything that they wanted out of all these bailout bills, out of the CARES Act. They gave their demands to the politicians, and the politicians gave it to them, no questions asked. And you see, look how they respond to big business as to how they respond to the American people. The overwhelming majority of the public wants healthcare. Fuck you, we can't do it. Industry wants $60 billion. Blank check, no questions asked. And I'll get into some of the details. So they had this vague agreement, oh, we'll give you the $60 billion in the CARES Act. If you cover the expenses, the payroll for your employees, and you don't lay off any employees and stuff like that. So the airline industry got the bailout that all industries should have gotten originally, which was the government just, give you the money, you pay the payroll, and just enough to keep the lights on. Well, they got way more than they needed to keep the lights on, and I'll get into that now. So overall, like I said, $75 billion is what they got in the 2 stimulus bills. And to show you how over the top and gratuitous this bailout of the industry was, I'm going to use just the example of Boeing and what they got in the CARES Act. And I'm going to show you how outrageous this is. And then, because you have to take into account, they did keep a lot of the employees on the payroll, but just months later, a lot of them did massive layoffs and fired a bunch of their employees or furloughed a bunch of their employees after they pocketed tens of billions of dollars from the government. So again, it was just basically like the government giving them a blank check, and hey, you could pay your payroll for a couple of weeks and then fire your employees whenever you feel like. With no apps, though, they could have written a guarantee into the CARES Act said, if you pay this money, under no circumstances can you fire your employees. They could have done that. They didn't do that. And they knew what was going to happen as a result. So like I said, let me get to the details of what Boeing got out of the CARES Act. And this is from a tweet from Dan Price on Twitter, like back in April of last year. So this was after Boeing already began laying off some of their employees right after they got the blank check from the government in the stimulus bill. Like I said, just in April. So they got the money less than a month ago, and they were already firing their employees. And they gave their CEO they had to fire over the scandal where Boeing planes were just dropping out of the sky because of a faulty sensor. So I believe maybe three, four, maybe it was either no, it was 2 or 3 Boeing planes crashed because of this problem with the sensor, and it was not an act of God. They chose on purpose to not purchase the sensor so that they could save money on the planes, and then this ended up leading to some of the planes crashing. So the CEO got fired. I don't know how he's not in prison, but he got fired, and the same year, Boeing gave him an $80 million exit package. That was enough to cover the payroll for 939 employees. The $80 million that they gave to their corrupt and incompetent CEO that led to the deaths of hundreds of people. And they got $17 billion in the COVID bailout, in the CARES Act. Boeing got $17 billion in the bailout. And they still cut jobs weeks after getting that money from the government. So all this money is just going into the pocket of these executives. And over the last 10 years, Boeing has spent 75% of the money of the profit that the company had, spent that doing stock buybacks. So basically inflating the price of their own stocks, and that gives bonuses to the executives and to the shareholders who own a lot of the stock in Boeing. So basically trying to double their wealth by just buying their own stock with their unlimited amounts of money that they get. So that's how they've been spending their money over the last 10 years. If they weren't doing that bullshit, if they put money aside and save money for a rainy day, like all the conservatives, the so-called fiscal conservatives like to say, if they had saved money for a rainy day, if they did not take 74% of the profits that they made and put it into stock buybacks, that's over billions of dollars over the last decade. If they hadn't have done that, they would have had the money to cover payroll, to cover all their business expenses, and they wouldn't have needed any kind of bailout from the government. So my position on the bailouts of the airline industry and several other industries, definitely the healthcare industry, my position on that wasn't this. It was, I would say, more radical than a lot of other people. Because when this happened, I was a firm believer that if the government was going to be putting up billions of dollars to save these industries that are essential to the functioning of the government of the country, then they should have nationalized those industries. And the government should have taken ownership of those industries, if it was permanently or temporarily, but definitely they should have taken ownership of the businesses. And when they do that, they get to operate at cost. You don't have to worry about all the overhead of paying CEOs and the shareholders tens of millions of dollars or anything like that. The government owns the business, the industry, and whatever it takes to keep it running, the government will just pay out of pocket. So to cover the payroll expenses for the employees who couldn't go to work, the government would take care of all of that. And then you would have, instead of it just being a blank check for the corporations, because there's certain benefits that the public gets when the government owns industries like the airline industry or the healthcare industry, then they get to control the cost. The price for the way that the airline industry operates, the prices and the price gouging and the horrible treatment of the customers, all of that is because, well, a lot of that is because there is no accountability to the public. But if it's government run, then corporate profits aren't the beginning and the end of the story. It is literally, it becomes a public service. And like I said, it operates a lot more efficiently and cost effectively than it does if it's owned by if it's a private industry, if it's a private corporation. So they should have nationalized the airline industry if they were just going to be writing blank checks to keep it in business anyway. But now let's move on to the healthcare industry. So I've talked about healthcare a lot recently. You can go check out any of the many videos that are posted recently about it. And you guys understand why I'm so disgusted by our barbaric for-profit private health insurance industry. But so during the pandemic, they've gotten $90 billion in subsidies from the government, these private health insurance companies. $90 billion in subsidies. And this is on top of the billions of dollars in subsidies that they were already getting from the government every single year pre-COVID. So then the pandemic hits, they get, again, just like the airline industry, special bailouts, multi-billion-dollar bailouts for the industry in all of these different stimulus bills. In the CARES Act, I believe, was $50 billion. And in the most recent one, I think it was like another $40 billion. Yes, $40 billion in COBRA subsidies and subsidies to lower the cost of premiums for people who buying healthcare in the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act exchange. So again, $90 billion plus all the other billions of dollars that they get from the government and then to get from taxpayers was just given to the industry during this emergency. So they ended up making more profit. They were making record profit during all of this. While people were going bankrupt, or people were losing their health care, or people were getting evicted, when people can't afford treatment, so they were staying home and dying from COVID, the insurance industry was seeing record profits, and the government contributed to that with the $90 billion that they just gave in a blank check in subsidies. And what did these subsidies cover? They didn't even, so the subsidies, in the most recent stimulus bill, the $40 billion that they're giving in subsidies, mostly going to cover COBRA premiums. So COBRA, insanely expensive health insurance plan for people who had an insurance plan from their employers previously, then they lost their job and they lost their insurance. COBRA is supposed to be an affordable healthcare plan, which it isn't. It's like twice, maybe 3 times as much as a regular insurance plan. And again, you have to factor in the problem that now you don't have a job and you don't have income, and now you have a health insurance plan that's 3 times as much expensive as your previous one that you had from your employee. So it's a giant corporate scam to begin with. And what they did was to cover the premiums for the people who had COVID, for people who have COBRA, all the way up to September. That's what the $40 billion, a big chunk of the $40 billion in the most recent stimulus bill is supposed to cover. So it's just, and I was very specific, it's just premiums. Nothing about deductibles, nothing about copays. If you still have COBRA, you have to pay all those things, and the government's still giving them billions of dollars. And the same with the private health insurance. There was, I think Joe Biden was saying that there's some people who might get like $50 less in their monthly premiums. So instead of paying like $350, instead of paying $400 in your premium, now you only have to pay $350. So you have to pay $300 on your premium. And again, that's not including deductibles. That's not including copays. That's not including any of the other out-of-pocket expenses that you'd have getting healthcare with private health insurance. So this whole thing was a fucking scam and just a giveaway to the industry, gratuitously, to the point where they're making record profits. Again, the government should have nationalized the health industry and provided healthcare to everybody free at the point of service, like every other modern industrial country in the world has figured out how to do over the last 100 years. So, but again, it just shows you how much they don't give a fuck about the public, and all they care about is serving their own interests and the interests of their corporate donors. So even if it means they will just keep writing these tens of billions of dollars in additional subsidies to the industry, even though it costs way more to do that than it would if everybody was covered under Medicare, for example. And there was I forgot where I saw it from, but it's basically somebody did some research and they found that the price that it is to cover, that the government is using to subsidize COBRA plans for people and private health insurance plans for people, it costs like 4 or 5 times as much as if they would just completely cover the cost themselves. If there was just a single payer, it would cost 4 or 5 times less than what they're doing now. So they're spending more money to cover less people. They know this, and they're still going to do it anyway because, again, all they care about is serving the corporate donors in the for-profit health insurance industry and the big pharma. Even if that comes at the expense of regular people who can't afford healthcare, life-saving healthcare, and end up dying as a result of it. I talk about all the time, there are about 68,000 people who die every single year pre-COVID because they can't afford basic healthcare. 500,000 people go bankrupt, lose everything because they can't afford to pay their medical bills. And while all this is happening, the government will spend more money to give blank checks to their buddies in the industry. And then all the while this is going on, the CEOs and the executives at these health insurance companies, they're getting paid tens of millions of dollars every year. Like some of the top insurance companies, top CEOs got paid like $30 million last year, $25 million, $20 million, $15 million. All because they're the middleman and they're price gouging people to give them life-saving healthcare, and they're going to take people's money and then also deny them healthcare. That's how they all make their money in the health insurance industry, and the government is going to continue to subsidize that at completely to no end. There is no price that is too much for them to continue to subsidize the private health insurance industry. But they won't give you healthcare even though it costs less and it would cover everybody. And the amount of people who die because they can't afford basic healthcare would be zero. They'll continue to do it anyway because they're that corrupt. So the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, that thing has been such a fucking scam from the beginning. And it is amazing to me how basically whatever was in the CARES Act, they've just grandfathered in as essential to any stimulus bill. And every single stimulus bill that passes ever since then is just a continuation of the same shitty policies. And the PPP is no exception. So, like I said, it was sold as this the government is giving away money to the small businesses to help them cover their expenses because they're going to go bankrupt and they can't cover their payroll, they can't cover their expenses, and they're going to end up closing because of COVID and the economic crisis. So they were selling this PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, as a way to keep small businesses afloat. And that was one of the very big selling points in the CARES Act because they're like, oh my God, you can't hold this up. We're giving all this money to small businesses. We have the $1,200 checks, the stimulus checks we're giving out to people. You can't hold this up and demand better. We need to get this out right now. So the Paycheck Protection Program was one of the big selling points, right? But after it passed, there was very little discussion about how the money was used. And if there was, it would be a very hard sell to continue to dump billions of dollars into this disgusting program every time a stimulus bill passed. So, for example, the way that the whole thing was set up, and I keep saying it's a scam, because it literally is a scam. It was fraudulent in nature, and it was a deception to help the rich run out the back door with all the money, even in this program meant for small businesses. So, the way they set it up, what the government could have done, like many other governments around the world, they could have just given the money directly to the small businesses. They have all the bank details and the bank information for all these different small businesses who would have needed money throughout this crisis, and like through the Small Business Administration or through the IRS, and they would have had the ability to just directly put whatever money these businesses needed to cover payroll and expenses. They could have done that from just directly through the government. But instead, they decided to put a middleman there. And they put it there for two reasons I can see. One is to make it look less corrupt than it is when they just gave the money to large corporations and well-connected, wealthy people in the country. It would look a lot worse if that was coming from the government. If the government was just picking favorites like that and just letting small businesses go bankrupt like they did. 60% of the small businesses that had to close because of COVID closed permanently. So that was a policy choice by Congress. So it would have looked extra gross if they had this giant pile of cash and they were just giving it out to their friends. That would look a lot worse. That's why they had the middleman, and the middleman that they set up was the large banks in this country. So they gave all the money for the PPP program that was written into the bill by Congress. They sent that money to the banks, and then the banks used it to create loans. And there was a multiplier effect. They got about $500 billion, and with the multiplier effect, they can leverage it up to 10 times. So they end up giving out loans that were over $5 trillion. And again, they now the banks made it loans. Instead of just giving out the money, they made it loans. And it's even worse because how do you expect these small businesses who have to close indefinitely to pay back these thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in loans when they have no revenue stream? So it made absolutely no sense from the beginning. They could have just made these grants, but they on purpose chose not to do that. And so the banks were in charge of these loans. Like I said, they gave it to the most well-connected, largest clients, big corporations. And then the banks ended up taking like $25 billion in service fees. So they charged $25 billion in fees for money that wasn't even theirs, that the government gave them to hand out to their customers. They charged $25 billion in fees. That's what I'm telling you. None of this is an accident. This was such an elaborate, well-planned, and well-thought-out heist. There's no other way to describe it. It was a heist, and they're helping them run out the back door with all the money instead of helping the regular people. And this is what was described by Naomi Klein in the shock doctrine, where there's these emergencies, whether it's a financial crisis or it's a natural disaster, whether it's a war. Anytime there are these emergencies, large-scale emergencies, the government, the neoliberals in government, use it as an opportunity to privatize necessary services and to give blank checks to their buddies, their corporate donors in industries. So, and it's been proven time and time again, like I said, like Naomi Klein went through in the shock doctrine. And so the Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina, the tsunami in I believe it was in Sri Lanka, the different countries where we've done regime change around the world. All of these were different emergencies, and they were exploited to advance a neoliberal agenda, a corporatist agenda. And that's exactly what happened with the response to the COVID and the economic crisis. And like I said, the PPP was such a perfect example of this, because it was written in such a way that lacked transparency, and it was just a giant corporate slush fund. And there was no debate over it. We had to get it out immediately because it's emergency. Like I said, using the cover of emergency to advance neoliberal corporatism. And to get $25 billion off of money that wasn't even yours to give to businesses in an emergency. Again, while you're some of these are the big banks, the most profitable corporations in the world, making billions of dollars in profit, CEOs making tens of millions of dollars, executives making tens of millions of dollars. And they still had to get theirs. They still had to get some in this emergency relief. And so there was studies done months later that showed over 50% of the money. It was still, we don't even know exactly how all the money was spent. Most of the money went to large businesses instead of the small businesses that needed the money, that needed their payrolls covered. Those businesses were left in the cold, they went bankrupt, and the big businesses got a piece of the giant corporate slush fund. And to make matters even worse, and to show you how intentional this all was, members of Congress were in on it. So they passed the PPP, they put the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, into the CARES Act, as shitty as they wrote it, on purpose, as the lacking transparency on purpose, so that they can take advantage of the situation. And the members of Congress themselves were getting hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars from the Paycheck Protection Program. And to this point, we still don't know how many members of Congress got access to the Paycheck Protection Program. But as far as we know, there have been 12 that are reported. And I'm guaranteed the number is way more than that. Specifically because of the lengths that they're going to not have to make that information public. And on top of that, some of the people who received the money were like Nancy Pelosi, her husband, businesses that her husband have partial ownership in, got anywhere from $500,000 to over $1 million from the Paycheck Protection Program. And 11 other members of Congress were getting hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, from the same program. So if the Speaker of the House is in on the corruption, she's in on the money grab, you think that all the other members of Congress are, oh, this is fucking free reign now. It's a free-for-all, and nobody's going to get in trouble for this. If the Speaker of the House is doing this, there's no way any of us are going to get in trouble. So I guarantee you the number of members of Congress who got in on the Paycheck Protection scam is way more than 12. I wouldn't be surprised if it's hundreds of members of Congress who were in on it. You had Pelosi's, Elaine Chao, who was Donald Trump's transportation secretary, also the wife of Mitch McConnell, getting millions of dollars from the Paycheck Protection Program. So this whole thing was a huge grift for anybody who was well connected in government, or just wealthy in a large corporation and have connections to the big banks. It was just a heist for them. So this, like, that's what I said. There's so many things to be outraged in the handling of this crisis. And yes, the way that they've left the public for dead, you can do endless commentary about that. But then the fact that they use this opportunity to make out like bandits themselves and help their giant corporate donors make out like bandits, it shows you that this isn't incompetence. This isn't that they just don't know what to do. They're taking advantage of the situation, and they know that they're working against the interests of the public, and they're working on behalf of the corporations, but they don't care, and they're doing it anyway. So I've been very adamant about this. Nobody who has been elected, nobody who's in federal office, none of these people should ever have public office ever again who've been responsible for the response to COVID and the economic crisis. They've all failed in such an epic way. They violated public trust in such an epic way. There is no excuses, no justification, there's no explanation anybody can ever give as to why any of them should ever have a job in government. It's not, public office isn't just, you aren't entitled to that. There's a certain responsibility that you have to the public. And if you don't meet that responsibility, if you fail to meet the moment in the worst emergency in U.S. history, then you are not fit to do the job. And there are hundreds of millions of other people in this country who can do the job. So I don't think any one of them should be in elected office again. And that includes Bernie Sanders and AOC, Ilhan, all the Justice Democrats, all the so-called progressives. Because they all went along with this bullshit. None of them, Bernie Sanders himself could have held up these bills. He could have held up the last stimulus bill. The stimulus bill that just passed couldn't have gone through without the approval of the Justice Democrats, without the yes vote of the Justice Democrats and Bernie Sanders. And they did it anyway. So when we elected them, the left elected them, campaigned for them, donated to them, volunteered for them, because we wanted people in government actually fighting on behalf of the public, actually looking out for the public interest in times just like this. But yet, like I said, the worst emergency in U.S. history. And what did they do? It's not like they didn't know about the shock doctrine. Most prominent lefties and definitely the people at the highest levels are familiar with Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. If they haven't read the book, they've heard the at least the theory behind it. So they knew it was coming, and when that came, and it continues to come every time they pass a stimulus bill, instead of objecting to the neoliberalism and objecting to the corporatism and to the rank corruption and oligarchy, they partake in it. They enable it. They give it cover. There was and it's not just me saying this now. Even people on CNN, MSNBC are saying, by Bernie Sanders going along with these stimulus bills, he gave Joe Biden progressive cover. He made it so that people on the left, it's harder for them to say, this is bullshit, this is oligarchy, this is corporatism, because hey, Bernie Sanders, leader of the left, he went along with it. So these people, they've all given cover to this giant, gratuitous, upward transfer of wealth. And they let the economy be devastated in a way that I really don't even understand. I can't put into words. They've changed the trajectory of this country for the worse, and many people will never recover from this. And it didn't have to be this way. If from the CARES Act, they said, okay, let's give everybody UBI. Let's do the monthly checks. Let's do single payer. Let's get everybody covered with healthcare so nobody has to pay any out-of-pocket costs. Let's cancel the rent and mortgage debts for the duration of the crisis. If they did all that, it would be a much different world and a much different future for the people in this country and for our economy. But they didn't do that. They all went along with this corporate heist. And so now whatever happens next, the chaos that ensues, the rise in violent crime, the dystopian future, like you've seen, if anybody if you've been in New York, if you've been in Times Square, you see the videos, or in any major city around the country, you see the videos and the pictures of stores boarded up and small businesses closed permanently. And it's like a ghost town in a lot of places. And that was a choice. The 40 million people about to be evicted because they're months behind on rent, that was a choice. The millions of people with the utilities already shut off and are going to be shut off, that was a choice by the government. The millions of people in food lines, all for the last year, that was a choice by the government. And people are just, I really don't, I've been shocked by how much people are just willing to just take it. People are just going to shrug their shoulders and be like, at least they gave me a one-time means-tested stimulus check, and I'll make this stretch as long as I can. And I'm not going to demand more from the government, even though the whole purpose of government is to serve the public, to provide services to the public, to be there to address emergency, large-scale emergency. That's the whole purpose of the government. And they've completely failed to do that part of their job. And instead, they've acted as a bagman for the rich and for corporations. And they've helped them run out the back door with all the money in this gratuitous upward transfer of wealth. That's how the government has responded to the worst economic crisis in history. Worse than the Great Recession in 2008 and worse than the Great Depression over 100 years ago. This is how they choose to respond to it.